welcome to this. This is the second workshop in a series that Monica Bolton and her colleagues have put together around trying to gain greater understanding about the management of ME and its diagnosis and mechanisms. And today we're going to concentrate on clinical trial platform studies, which have been remarkably successful during the COVID-19 period, which many of you will be aware of. But we see opportunity for such trial designs to be helpful in ME. So we've got two speakers who are experts in platform trials, in that they've done platform trials in other fields. These are sort of adaptive design clinical trials that allow testing of multiple interventions simultaneously and adding new treatments as they become available in the same trial structure with multiple sub-trials. So it's really a very exciting potential opportunity for this particular area, ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, and we want to learn really from our two speakers. We have Jeremy Chataway, who will be joining us a little later on to give a 15-minute talk about his experience in multiple sclerosis. We're going to start off with Ami Banerjee, who's Professor of Clinical Data Science at the Institute of Health Informatics at the University College London, and is a cardiologist at UCL and Barts NHS Trust. And Ami is going to tell us a bit about the Stimulate ICP trial, I believe, and the long COVID study he's now currently engaged with. So, Ami, thank you very much. And it's over to you, 15 minutes of your experience, please.
Very much, Stephen. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm trying to do so. Okay, can you see that? Okay, should be on full view now.
Yeah, that's good.
Good. Okay, marvelous. So I'm going to give a brief introduction into long COVID and multi-organ impairment and how our study came about, and then tell you more about the trial in Stimulate ICP that I am the PI for, and that's principal investigator. So I spend 70% of my time as an academic at University College London, 30% of my time as a cardiologist. I don't think, sorry, I should have put in a slide on conflicts of interest. I just realised I don't think I have any relevant conflicts of interest other than that I have NIHR funding for the Stimulate ICP study, which I'm the PI of. So, as this audience will be aware, post-viral syndromes aren't new. Infectious diseases have had recognised longer-term symptoms for some time from the literature, ranging from Epstein-Barr virus, commonly known as glandular fever, to Ebola, to polio, Lyme disease, and ME/CFS. Fatigue is the most common across these syndromes, tends to be multi-system or multi-organ, and both the research and a clinical focus on acute rather than chronic phase, whether when treating individual patients or planning for system responses, has led to a focus on acute rather than chronic. Just briefly, long COVID, there are similarities to other post-viral syndromes, but one of the difficulties is the scale of COVID infection and the proportion of people who develop longer-term symptoms. So health systems have been hit with a really large-scale challenge in a way that previous post-viral syndromes have been more chronic, if you will. The definition, because it's a new disease, is still a work in progress. It's mainly based on evidence of COVID infection and chronicity, as in 3 months or more of persistent symptoms after recovery from the viral infection. But beyond that, we haven't got a biomarker or set of tests that we can do to define long COVID. So across research studies and clinical studies, there is still variation in definition. This group of individuals has very variable symptoms, which means that there's probably multiple syndromes within the syndrome, and certain groups have certain organ-specific sequelae or consequences, be it in the heart or the lungs or certain neurological features, but we've not been able to yet cluster them satisfactorily. There are different mechanisms which have been proposed, and therefore different research approaches. Now, long COVID and the way that COVID interacts or causes long-term conditions can be thought of in this learning health system kind of framework, where these traditionally different silos of science, evidence, and care are connected together. And so I've used the example of cardiovascular disease and multimorbidity, which can be seen as a risk factor, as a concurrent bystander of long COVID, and as an outcome. So people develop new multimorbidities as a result of this post-viral condition, and there are direct, indirect, and longer-term effects of COVID. In terms of the factors that might cause this is also still very much in the research phase. We don't know. In terms of the virus, is it persisting? Is it being reactivated after being diminished in its activity? Is it interacting with bacteriophages? Is there an issue with immune dysregulation or with autoimmunity? Or is it that there is a chronic inflammation, or the fact that we've seen there is a relationship with certain metabolic conditions, diabetes, with obesity? Is there something along the metabolic axis that's causing this? And there's certain evidence from various domains pointing in those. But from my point of view as a clinician and data scientist, I'm interested more in the downstream than in the basic science research, that these mechanisms are leading to people having all manner of symptoms across different organs. So, in the heart, that can manifest as chest pain and palpitations, the lungs as shortness of breath, and the pancreas as new diabetes, and so on. And really, there's documentation suggesting that almost any system could be affected. Just to give you an example, early on in the pandemic, we conducted a study called the CoverScan study, which looked at multi-organ MRIs. And this is really in the early first wave of the pandemic, because we didn't know how the organs were all affected. And we found that in a group of 500 people, one fifth of them had cardiac abnormalities at 6 months, and at 12 months, 40% of those continued having abnormalities on their cardiac MRI, that's demonstrable on imaging with symptoms. And I'm not going to dwell on this because I want to get to the trial, but there's evidence similarly from different studies, different cohorts, different countries, from looking at lungs and symptoms, and people compare with healthy matched controls, matched meaning by age and sex. This is a systematic review which has looked at different symptoms and event rates across the spectrum of long COVID. So this truly is multi-system. Anywhere can be affected, and that's not changed since we were funded in 2021. We started in August 21, and we are doing a trial which is Work Package 2, but we also were using this learning health system approach to look at current care. So in England, long COVID clinics were rolled out, starting with my colleague Melissa Heitman, who was the national lead for long COVID. In April 2020, they started to treat people with longer term symptoms from COVID, but by December, 60 clinics had been opened around the country, and that was up to 100 at peak. Now those have been commissioned locally, and so certain clinics have been closed, unfortunately, around the country. Should note that in Scotland and Wales there weren't long COVID clinics, but we in Work Package 1 we're doing service evaluation and epidemiology, looking at the pathway where people are referred from primary care clinic, having basic investigations such as a chest X-ray or ECG. They get assessed in the long COVID clinic, and then they're at some point discharged with rehabilitation. But there's no drug treatments. Just to mention Work Package 3, we also have been looking at how we deal with inequalities which have been documented well for whether it's ME/CFS or other long-term conditions like my home turf of cardiovascular disease, where there's geographic inequalities, there's inequalities by gender, there's inequalities by ethnicity, and some of which have been worse for long COVID. So this case finding intervention was to provide education and data to GPs and health systems to try and improve those inequalities, which we're documenting. And also we've been looking across COVID, long COVID, comparing it with other long-term conditions, including depression, COPD, cardiovascular disease, to look at differences in healthcare utilization. So now to the bit that you want to hear about, which is the trial. I should say Stimulate ICP, that I've spelt out the acronym there, but because we knew so little and still have big gaps, we were covering symptoms, trajectory, inequalities and management, and trying to address and transform existing integrated care pathways, which is what the pathway at the top in that simple schematic is. So making that slightly bigger. So the middle, let's concentrate on the trial, the platform trial. So we wanted to do two things: a trial of a pathway. So the pathway being, first of all, a multi-organ MRI scan, because different organs have been affected, and we already were seeing at that stage that people were being sent from one specialist to another, and whether imaging would help focus and treat things earlier. And also, given that we haven't got a proven treatment yet, we wanted to rule out other diseases that might be causing people symptoms as well. That's part of the long COVID clinic's role. So that's the first intervention, and the second is a digital rehabilitation platform called Living with COVID Recovery, which was already funded by NIHR and was already available. So what we did was at the cluster level, meaning at the level of a long COVID clinic, people were randomized to get scan or not, or get digital app or not. In that study, we needed to be powered to answer our question of whether that improves either of those improve outcomes. We need to have 1,130 people. I'm pleased to say we've recruited 1,100 people, and so we have to finish recruitment by end of July. But I think we're well on track to doing that. We also have an embedded drug platform study. So there are 3 drug arms and a no drug arm. The drugs that we've been looking at are an antihistamine combination of loratadine and famotidine, an anti-inflammatory called colchicine, and an anticoagulant, so an anti-clotting agent called rivaroxaban, and comparing with no drugs at all. This is an open label, randomized trial. We chose to do open label because getting these different drugs in placebo in the height of the pandemic was going to take too long to organise. That would add more months. We didn't know that actually we would be delayed in terms of the ethical approvals and so on, and adding different drugs at that stage. But that's why it's open label. And the drug randomization is at the individual level. People who have side effects to any of those drugs aren't eligible for the trial, so that we are looking at the overall general population with long COVID. Now, in order to answer the question of whether these drugs work or not, we need 800 patients. We currently have 650, and we again are aiming to finish in the next couple of months, because that's when our funding runs out in March of next year, and we have to have 6 months of follow-up data on all of these patients. So we're currently in the final push to make sure that we can reach that target. We went for this design because if I start with why we chose these drugs already there was preliminary data that people have been using these drugs either off label or over the counter themselves. And so these are still questions that are unanswered today. And we're, just to be clear, we're looking at people who are non-hospitalized. So there is another study called the FOSS-COVID study, which has done an observational analysis in large numbers of people who are hospitalized with COVID. And there's also been a trial called HEAL-COVID, which looked at people who'd been admitted to ITU. This is the only trial, to my knowledge, of drugs in the non-hospitalized group. That's a platform designed like this. So we are looking at 3-month fatigue assessment scale as our primary outcome, but we have a battery of different measures that we're looking at in these individuals. Just for your ease, just blown that up there. I've said all of that. So it's what's called a 2x2 factorial design. I've said that it's the integrated care part is cluster randomized. The drug trial is individual. The plan had been to be able to add more drugs, both because of funding, but mainly because of problems in recruitment, which I can speak to later. We haven't been able to add more drugs because we need to answer the questions for the drugs that we already have. There were 6 original sites: Hull, Liverpool, Leicester, Derby, Exeter, London. Of those, only London and Leicester are still open. There's a variety of reasons, including staff sickness with long COVID, defunding of local long COVID clinic services, which has led to that situation. But we've got 6 further sites: Oxford, Reading, a Highland site, Tameside, Plymouth and Sheffield, which are currently recruiting. Because of the long COVID clinic model, and even if recruitment is in primary care, this is scalable, we believe, and it was pragmatic. I've told you about our recruitment to date. I think it's really important in pandemic scenarios and the current political and financial landscape to realise that it's really hard to do trials when there's so much pressure on systems, because whether it's your research nurses or your clinicians who are recruiting, they're working in that strained system, and unless you make trials easy to do, that they're extra work which doesn't get done, and that's the genuine issue that we've faced. This is just going back to why we chose these drugs, because when we look autonomic symptoms, inflammation, problems with clotting, the mast cell activation were issues that were common, and rather than looking at new drugs, we had been funded to look at repurposable drugs. So that's why we're looking at these drugs. They're not looking at underlying mechanisms of viral persistence, immune system, or metabolic dysfunction, which we would like to do and have sought further funding for. There's a website, there's a published protocol, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ami. That's great. I think it's best if we go straight on just for the moment. If you can hang on, Ami, and Jeremy comes in now on the MS studies that he's been involved with, because then we can sort of have questions that obviously coming from both your experiences. And Jeremy Chataway is Professor of Neurology at UCL and a consultant neurologist at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery and UCLH, and he's been doing trials in multiple sclerosis, and he's going to tell us a little bit about that, and particularly the Octopus trial, I think, Jeremy. So
lovely. Thank you very much indeed for having me. Monica, I think you're going to display my slides kindly.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much indeed. So this is the Octopus trial, a multi-arm, multi-stage platform in progressive multiple sclerosis. The next slide, just my disclosures, none are relevant here. And the next slide. So I'm going to talk through these aspects over the next 15 minutes about this MAMS trial in multiple sclerosis and things that we have learned through this. And the next slide. So multiple sclerosis, I mean, it's interesting. It's a neuroinflammatory disease, and fatigue actually is a major part of it. And we see this a lot. And then it has a more degenerative component. So people have the relapsing remitting course with they have attacks. For example, they might lose vision or become paralyzed, lasting for a few weeks and a few months, and then they recover with or without corticosteroids. So there's the relapses and the remissions. And in the last 20, 30 years, there's been a revolution in terms of treatments for this aspect that you can see on the left, the so-called disease-modifying treatment, such as monoclonal antibodies targeting B cells. But underneath, there's a degeneration that causes progression, either secondary, SPMS, or from the beginning, the primary, the PPMS. And so the task in multiple sclerosis is to reduce down the progression, the gradient of progression, and ideally, of course, repair it one day. And the next slide shows that it's a curve that shows the most powerful anti-inflammatory ocrelizumab, derivative of rituximab, a B cell treatment, reducing the B cell lymphocytes. And on the right, you can see whilst there's an effect, there's still a lot of way to go compared to placebo in terms of a progression of patients, which shows the gap that we got to work with, and therefore trialing different medications in a timely fashion that might have an effect more on the regenerative side of things. And just the next slide. On the right are some of the other mechanisms which are at play in the central nervous system. So MS affects the brain, the spinal cord, the optic nerve. So a number of mechanisms which are difficult to define in vivo, in real life in humans. Whilst we have MRI scans, we can't get to this level of detail. And of course, we can't take biopsies of the brain. So we think a variety of mechanisms, oxidation, mitochondria, the energy, iron, and so on and so forth are at play. So thinking about treatments that might target those and then have an effect on reducing progression in multiple sclerosis. And the next slide. So really over the last 7 years, this became a major priority for the Multiple Sclerosis Society, the UK MS Society, which funds this work, this trial entirely. And so a variety of working parties were put together to look at what sorts of medication might be useful, to look at trial design, to look at outcome measurement. And I think it's worth saying from the beginning, there's a huge patient participant involvement of this. And this is really kind of co-designed with PPI and the UK MS Society. And they sit on the various steering groups and boards of this trial. And it's a very, very harmonious and excellent relationship. And really, all parties can see at all time what's going on. So on the left is a long list of drugs, and these have come out of the experimental laboratories that might have an effect in progressive multiple sclerosis. The problem is, to test all of these would take, 500 years. And so there needs to be some way of filtering it down and some way of doing trials more quickly, because trials take years and years, unfortunately. So can we kind of concertina down this process? And to cut to the shape, a variety of international and national working parties were put together, which produced a top 10 or top 9 list that you can see on the right. And then we've taken into trial this first phase of the trial, the top 2 of those. One called metformin, which is used in diabetes, but has regenerative properties, and a lot of animal work, and one a vitamin called alpha lipoic acid, where a lot of work has been done in North America. So those are the 2 first active treatments, which I'll show you, which we're running in the Octopus trial against the control. And if we move to the next slide. So what are multi-stage? So traditionally, it's a kind of 1-to-1. So you have mid-phase, which we call phase 2. Can you see some sort of signal in an instrument of interest, such as a scan or a questionnaire? And then you go into, do you actually affect the final clinical outcome that you're interested in this case, disability? And you keep on going one by one by one. The problem is one by one takes a long time, and there's a lot of white space, i.e. the years go by before we can move into the phase 3 if we find a positive in the phase 2. So on the right is this cartoon that shows that what we've done here is we've combined it. So when you're starting, if you like, the race from the top, we try a number of different treatments against a common control. And if there's a signal halfway, then we carry on, and then we drop our medications that are not showing an effect, and then we can bring in new medication. So the whole thing just keeps on going in a sort of perpetual fashion, because if you stop and start, the bureaucracy and the regulation is very high. Everyone at all time are on current standard of care. So, and that's worth saying. So the standard of care changes, then everyone will go on to standard of care, and we keep on going. And if we look at the next slide, so this is a different way of looking at it in a sort of horizontal schematic. The patients at the beginning, participants are randomized, everyone on standard of care, but to the dummy, the control, or treatment 1 or treatment 2. Then there's an interim analysis, and you can see there that treatment 4 was stopped, and then we carry on, and you can see here treatment 1 and 3 are stopped, but we carry on with treatment 2 and the control until we get the final definitive answer. And the next slide. So I've worked for the last 10 years or so with Professor Max Palmer, who's the director of the MRC Clinical Trials Unit, who has led this particular model in metastatic prostate cancer really over 20 years. And I'm going to show you his work. And that's his trial called the Stampede trial, where there was no change in treatment for 40 years. And really now there's been at least 6 or 7 treatments which are now in clinical practice using this multi-arm, multi-stage platform model. And if I show you some of his slides, the next slide. So as I said, here we are. After the setup, he begins the trial and patients are randomized into the control, which is ADT, path A, and then different medications of interest and combinations. And you can see there the randomization when it began. Using a mixture of repurpose, that is drugs that are used for other things which could have an effect, such as celecoxib, or drugs which are licensed for other parts of prostate cancer, such as docetaxel. And that's the randomization that took place. And then the next slides show what happened. So here we are 6 years later, and you can see that arm D and arm F was stopped. And then you can see a new arm G was carried on. And this is a highly efficient process. And as we see now, even a radiotherapy arm is added in arm H. So different modalities can be used. They don't just have to be drug treatments. They could be physiotherapy treatments. They could be psychological treatments. And here we have radiotherapy. So they remain on the entire schema of this platform. And the next slide, that's just a summary, and they continue to report out. And the next slide, I think about 15,000 people have taken part in this trial so far. And the next slide, yeah, and that just takes us through that. Okay, now if we look at this slide, this is the kind of time it takes to get going, if you like, the admin trial time. So that's the first set of comparisons. And now if we look at the next slides, you can see that it gets quicker and quicker because you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can add an appendix to your existing protocol when you take it back to the MHRA and ethics committee. So that speeds up. And of course, time is money in this situation, as well as, of course, trying to get to the answer as quick as possible. And the next slide. Recovery trial, well, of course, from our first talk, we've talked about COVID, but just to show that the recovery trial, the original acute recovery trial, was an example of a platform trial and the huge success that came from that. And the next slide. Platform trials actually are not new. They have been done in the last 50 or 60 years, but in fact, they've become more popular, probably, I think, due to more efficient statistical methods and operational methods, and also a larger number of compounds which require testing and how to do them in a reasonable fashion, when generally the timeline of testing is measured not in days or months, but in years. So mainly they've been carried out in infectious diseases and oncology. And I've shown you a neurological example. There's also a motor neurone disease platform trial that we're involved in called MND SMART, and other ones will come. And the next slide. So what are the issues? Why aren't they done all the time? There's no doubt there needs to be expertise statistically and operationally. There is money involved, of course, to set up the platform and to run the platform, and then to run it in a multi-site fashion. So I'll just show you a couple of slides here. So the next slide shows the, if you like, the challenge in terms of the original trial design. Although I have to say, I think it's much like conventional trials. You just need to sit down with groups of interested people and sort of work your way through it and set up the working groups as shown. And the next slide. And just flick through these points, I think. Yeah, I think sometimes the hardest thing is to start, because one can spend years never starting. And sometimes one has to start and you have to fail, but you need to kind of pick up and keep going. And I think that's important, because if you don't start, you'll never find anything. And all these sort of wonderful things in the laboratory will never be tested in human beings with the condition of interest. And I think that's a really important principle. But of course, you can't do everything, and these things do cost money. So one needs to focus in one resources. and working, of course, with a variety of partners, whether they be government or charities or biotech or whatever. And the next slide. So yes, a useful point is statistically it's good if the different drugs or interventions are as different as the other ones as possible in terms of mechanism of action, for the reasons that we say here. And at the interim analysis, we're fairly liberal in terms of bringing through compounds, so it's not too strict. So we're trying to, if you like, we have might have a reasonable false positive rate, but trying to very stringent in terms of the false negative rate. The next slide. Yeah, I think we can just flick through those, and the next slide. Yeah, so as Max Palmer would say, it's a machine, and we just got to make this, got to construct the machine, and then after doing a trial, don't destroy the machine, keep the machine going, feed it with new compounds. And I'll show you what we've done then in the octopus trial. The next slide. So we laid out our workings in this paper, and the next slide. So what you need is an interim outcome, not the final outcome, which is disability, but something that's related to that. So if you can change this, there's a good chance you can have an effect on your final outcome. Now, in progressive multiple sclerosis, it's MRI. It doesn't have to be. In motor neurone disease, it's a questionnaire. And then the final outcome is death or severe mortality. So we know in multiple sclerosis, there's a natural shrinkage of the brain that goes on, and you can measure that, and it's more than is normal. So if we show the next slide, and those areas in red have been lost over 2 years. These are different compartments of the brain. And so the rate of atrophy is about 0.7, 0.8% per year, where normally it's down at about 0.2%. So you can measure it, and if your medication can reduce that rate, there's a good chance, not 100%, that ultimately, those couple of years later, it will have an effect on disability. And so the next slide, I'll miss that one. And the next slide. So here we have the schema for this multi-arm, multi-stage design. So patients come in, they're randomized to the control, treatment 1, metformin, treatment 2, lipoic acid. Everyone's on best standard of care. They carry on. We do an MRI scan at 18 months, see if it's a difference against the control, and then we drop or not the arm, and then we carry on with future treatments. And the next slide. So as I said, a lot of PPI involvement, which has been critical to our success. And the next slide. So indeed, we are recruiting. So the first stage of this, which will end this year, we aim to recruit 375 patients, and we're at 244, so that's okay. And then we'll carry on recruiting into the non-MRI stage of this trial. And the next slide. Those are just the monthly recruitment figures. So we're recruiting about 20 per month. And we have an electronic portal. So rather than having to go through the doctor or the nurse to get into the trial, everyone who's interested puts their details into a secure portal. And then that's filtered down to see if that person is suitable or not for the trial. And then we have an electronic dialogue with that person. And then if that person says, well, I live in Edinburgh, then Edinburgh will receive a list of people who would like to take part in this trial, so that we can reduce what's called the screen failure when you see that person and it's not suitable for them. But this has been successful. We have a number of thousands of people waiting to take part. And the next slide. Those are just our timelines. So we'll look at the interim in sort of mid-26, and then we aim to add in a new arm or two before that moment in time. And we carry on. We can leave that. Again, we have a lot of electronics and websites and communication on this trial. And the next slide. Just to show there's a large team of people who are involved in this work, operationally, statistically, database, and clinically. And the trial sites, we have about 15 sites at the moment around the country, and then we'll probably expand to another 30. And the next slide. Funded, as I said, entirely by the UK MS Society. And the next slide. Yeah, that's us from Queen Square. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, superb, both of these presentations, and thank you very much. And we've got a little time for questions now, about 20 minutes, I think. I mean, there's no, from my point of view, and I'm not a neuroscientist or a cardiovascular physician, but I'm a respiratory physician and interested in immunology. It seems to me these platform studies are exactly the way we should be going forward in ME. I think what will be the debate is how do you get to the list of drugs which you both have talked about efficiently, because that seems to be the key thing. Having identified the drugs, having sort of entry criteria and sort of clinical and pathological mechanistic insight into the disease really helps. And of course, with ME, we have problems in that area in terms of objective measures. We have plenty of subjective measures, but not the sort of objective measures that you've both been talking about in long COVID and in and multiple sclerosis. And then the funding, and I do like the idea of engaging the MRC Clinical Trials Unit, and Max Palmer, who I know well, because he's at UCL as well. And this idea of having one of the best clinical trial organizations in the world running a study, getting the best minds on the problem, which both of you have emphasized is important here, would seem to me a very good pathway if we could persuade Max and the MRC that this is something that will naturally follow on, Jeremy, from what you're doing, you know. Because to me, you know, we could talk to MRC seriously then and the NIHR about funding and all those things. Because we do not have charities in this area with anything like the funding that could support a platform trial. Absolutely not. So those are the comments. Yeah. We have questions. I'm sorry, I'm echoing a bit. I don't know why, but we have questions in the comments box. Many of these questions that people are asking are about mechanistic insights into various diseases you've been talking about, like long COVID, which I think is all fine. But I think because we're a bit limited for time, we need to just concentrate on the clinical trial, platform clinical trial. And I'd like, if you wouldn't mind, if anyone has any questions they would like to put to either our speakers or both of them about the clinical trials. And maybe Monica, you might like to come in first about, you know, how would you design such a trial? That's been one of your sort of areas of great interest. And you've been doing some intervention studies yourself and published with them using therapeutics. So I'd be keen to hear your comments to start with, please.
Can I say Harman Mark's got his hand up, so can we do him first and then
Yeah, let's do him first. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. So please come in. Yeah, Mark.
Hi, it's all very interesting. Thanks for great talks. The first thing that came to mind was I'm a member of an oversight committee for one of these trials in a different country. And looking at this as a GP, there's great potential, but it is very difficult to organize such things in the real world of primary care, for instance. So that's one of my questions. So if you're sort of thinking about extending this into more like a community or a primary care environment, my experience, it becomes much more difficult to sort of set it up. Is it true that it's more of a hospital thing or a secondary care thing?
Yeah, very good point you made.
Yeah, so I mean, you're right from the multiple sclerosis side of things in terms of the outcomes or the clinical outcomes that are required. We do it in neuroscience centres. You are right. I don't think it would work in individual GP practices. Nonetheless, we do have a lot of patient-reported outcome measures which we collect electronically and remotely, and this has been a success of the database. So patients, for that aspect, don't have to be in a neuroscience centre. We are, all of us, I think, increasingly trying to work out how we can do remote trialing, let's say, from people's houses, and limit the time that face-to-face outcome assessments are carried out. So that would be my comment from my side.
Thanks. Yeah.
May I add, Stephen? Would that be okay?
Yeah.
So in the case of long COVID, but I think in general the key is to think about the pathway that patients follow in respective systems. And long COVID, as my colleague Melissa Heitman said, that we're building the plane while we're flying it. And so there's some places around the country that are having GP-based clinics. There's some which are community-based. There's some which are hospital-based. And so we had to be rather pragmatic in this regard when we were setting this up at the application stage in 2020, that we're randomizing people to the scan when they're referred as suspected long COVID, which is absolutely when the GP is needed, and that's the best time to pick up. Depending on the information systems, the EHR, electronic health record systems, the coding and the ability to pick people up, that also in the UK, in some ways, we're really helped by our primary care colleagues. So I wouldn't want you to go away thinking that you can only do platform trials in hospitals. In fact, we're heavily reliant on efficiencies that we don't have in hospitals that we do have in primary care.
Good. Well, that's encouraging. Thank you. Monica, would you like to come in, please?
Yes, I'd love to. The first one is, it seems obvious to me that if you combine the best of these studies, the best aspects of both these studies together, we have a ready-made platform study for ME. But a couple of quick questions then. How do you manage your other roles? What percentage of your time is on the platform study, and what is on the kind of roles that you are carrying on anyway? What skills do you need for a chief investigator? Because this is one of our big deficiencies within the ME world. And how could you roll, is it possible simply to roll Stimulate ICP onwards into the ME community with some adaptations?
Okay, start with Amy. Amy, would you like to start first, and then we'll go to Jeremy, who can reflect.
Yeah. So let me. There's a few questions that you've hidden away in that statement. So let me take the first one. So what skills do you need as a PI? So I'm, full disclosure, I'm a cardiologist. I'm originally an epidemiologist who shifted into data science, and this is the first large trial that I've managed. I've been a site trial lead, but not led a trial. So I've been definitely learning and supported by a very large team in this regard, and whether it's NIHR or other funders, this is a team sport, so it's not one person who leads it. So whether it's the first trial you do, or you're, I'm not sure but Jeremy may well be a very experienced trialist and have done lots of trials. But obviously Max Palmer is very important in his particular trial. I'm working with people in the trials unit, which is actually at University of Central Lancashire, and similarly they're very well versed in complex interventions. So I think the team is important, but that shouldn't put you off. In terms of how you manage your time, it's like any of us who are kind of split research, clinical, or just research. You balance it with your other projects, and it's never. It's always more than what you put on the grant form. So I think I can't even remember if it was 15% of my time, but I'm sure at times it's been much more of that. So then in terms of carrying on Stimulate, so it is a question of money and ethics. So we have a no cost extension to finish our study have to be finished by March 25. So it would involve taking this model and protocol and applying for new funding, and defining the cohort that you want of people with ME/CFS. Our learning in long COVID, I would say, is the challenge is if you take all comers, then it be harder to define the effects of drugs and treatments than if you were looking in particular subtypes. And that's part of the challenge, I think, also in ME/CFS, is that there's some heterogeneity as well across the different types of ME/CFS that people might have, which are not well defined. And so who you'd recruit, trying to think who would be most likely to respond, so that you recruit the right people into your trial.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to add in, yes, I mean, I've done trials for about the last 10 or 15 years. This is the first multi-arm, multi-stage trial. I did a multi-arm trial, phase 2. I think, as said, it's at least 50 or 60% of one's trial, and then I do my clinical outpatients in the others. There's always something to do every day. Key, I think, is working with a very good trials unit that's done these style of trials before, not any old trial unit. Working with a charity, essential. We would never be in this position at all without the UK MS Society. And also you as a CI need to kind of bind together the country. You know, you have to have your dedicated sites around the country who will go the extra mile in terms of recruiting, processing, and giving good quality data when times get hard and, you know, the fluctuations of the health service and the research come together. Going back to one original point, these are very good vehicles for collecting samples, biofluid samples, and other samples imaging in terms of mechanistic. So I think you can gain real mechanistic understanding in a randomized control way against control. So there are many other advantages to doing these sorts of things, but they are big vehicles, but they're worth doing ultimately.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you both. They're really helpful comments. Monica, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Subgrouping, I think, is an interesting one. How did you approach that in the Stimulate ICP? Because in our previous workshop, it kept being raised, particularly by people with ME, that we are not all the same. At the point you designed it, you actually didn't know much about ME, and yet you did actually manage to think about subgrouping and different types of drugs going forward.
Yeah, I'm not sure we do actually know. There have been, even recently, for example, the FOSP COVID study, which was looking at hospitalized patients, several thousand of them, and has done a large scale genomic and proteomic analysis to try and look at the mechanisms and underlying subtypes. Even there, they acknowledged that I think it was 4 subtypes based on inflammation in which organs were affected that they looked at a bit, but they said they were overlapping and not sure how these apply to the clinical situation. So we because we were doing the MRI scans, because we've got really detailed symptoms, we can do a kind of post hoc subgroup analysis, but we're not by subgroup recruiting people to particular drugs. We were asked that even at the ethics stage, for example, whether only people above a certain inflammatory marker level, such as CRP, would be going into the anti-inflammatory arm. But there's not even evidence for that in other studies and other diseases. So we and the ethics committee felt that at this stage it was better to take all comers, but have the ability to look at particular subtypes and change if new data came up to suggest that we should be doing a particular test for clotting on everybody before we put them on randomized anticoagulant, then that's what we should do. But we haven't got to that stage actually. So yeah, we are still taking recruiting all people with referred to long COVID clearance.
And in the ME area, Amy, there's been a study called Decode ME where over 20,000 ME patients have been recruited. It's about 23,000 now, I think, to do DNA sequencing on salivary spit samples, which is going remarkably well. And part of all of that has been the administration of questionnaires to all of these patients with quite detailed phenotypic characterization questions in the questionnaires designed for substratification should that become important when they do the genetic analysis. But this is 20-odd thousand people who are all in large part, and Monica can correct me if I'm wrong here, in large part who are willing to undertake further research. And I'm sure intervention research, which is what we're talking about today, you know, is something that all patients, I think, would be interested in, to be honest. And they've got all the ethics and signed up and all that sort of stuff in place. So it's, and this is a national cohort, basically, across the whole country, which is there. It doesn't mean that the same researchers do the work, but the actual patient population is there. And our wonderful charities, which is hosting it today, Action for ME, and then the ME Association, they've both been very instrumental in getting this wonderful relationship with patients to the state that we now have it. And many of them are on the call, I suspect, today, which is very nice. So I think we're leaning on an open door here, and we haven't got a zero starting point. I think we do have a starting point, and we haven't engaged those people yet.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. Just one comment to temper that we at various points, Office for National Statistics have said there's 2 million people with long COVID. We because of the way we were recruiting, we couldn't recruit fully nationally, but we had 6 and now 12 clinics. In any trial, even if you look at the best recruiting trials, if you are getting 10 to 15% of the people you screen in, you're doing well, and there's all kinds of factors that play. And we've done, like Jeremy in his trial, we've done very extensive PPI group, and sometimes with the changing landscape, what was true in 2021 is not true in 2023, and so on. So we need to be really more agile sometimes in this moving landscape.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're getting close to our time. I'm looking down the list of people who have joined us, and thank you all for joining us today for this. Whether there are any questions anyone else would like to put to our two speakers or to anybody on the call.
Jeremy Harm has his hand up again.
Yeah, good. Okay. Harm, please come in.
Yeah, I've had my chance. I'll try it again. Two comments. One is that I've been involved in probably over 25 randomized clinical trials in primary care. And yeah, the inevitable issue is that you need a lot of money to start. So this needs several million, I think, at least to fund infrastructurally. And the other thing, I alluded to the Panorama trial, the Oxford trial that my Dutch colleagues were working with.
Yeah.
And I think the key issue is to have a viable candidate drug. Yeah. So if you I think that was stopped because the drug didn't do so much as they thought it would. So that's a key thing, I think, to have something that might work, and it could be a drug that is already available, like metformin, but it's very difficult to sell. Any study that doesn't have a drug that many doctors in the world think could potentially work is not going to fly.
Yeah. Very good point. I think we are in that situation now, Harm, as far as I can imagine. I mean, I think we would be able to draw up a list of maybe 20-odd things that are being tried and go through a process. I mean, Monica's been involved in one particular drug that looks quite exciting, but there are a couple of others out there that are already people are, done several trials in different places and are getting positive outcomes, but they're not big enough really to be that confident about. So that's in a way why we're having this conversation today.
Sure. Yeah, I totally agree, but there are some pitfalls. That's just my point.
Yeah, I know. It's well taken. Thank you. Okay.
Stephen, there's a couple of questions in chat. I don't know if you want to take them.
Yeah,
There's
well, I
one.
can take them. They're not much. They're mostly concerned with mechanistic questions. But I'm very happy to do that because our colleagues obviously are involved in the mechanisms of their disease. But I think the first question, which came from you, Alan, which is a comment really, which is about the similarity between ME and some aspects of long COVID, particularly the sort of more non-specific, the post-exertional fatigue, malaise, and all of that. Which I think there is a bit of an issue here, which we're struggling with, and we've got to deal with, in that the communities, both the medical communities and the patient communities, with these different disorders, haven't really come together in the way that I think we really should see. And last night I was at a dinner in London saying exactly the same thing. There seem to be parallel tracks because the post-COVID thing happened following a single virus over 2 years, and that was a whole thing that Department of Health and Social Care got involved with. Whereas ME, has had a real struggle over the last 50 years to get an identity. It's got one now, and I think it's definitely moving in the right direction. But we somehow need to get these two communities and the scientists working on them to work across and between them, and that process needs to happen. So that's a hearts and minds job, I think, both at the level of government and the researchers. I think the patients will be quite keen, but the long COVID patients are a bit concerned that the ME patients haven't made that much progress over the last 50 years, and it certainly isn't their fault. It's the way the whole thing has been handled, I think, going forwards. But anyway, those are just my comments on it. And of course, long COVID is going to be a wonderful exemplar, I think, of ME with a very tightly defined virus, and a lot of these wonderful longitudinal studies like FOS-COVID and the one that you're doing, Amy. There's terrific new data going to come out of all of this, which we haven't got yet, to help us with the ME world. And then recruiting into severe patients. I mean, we have long discussions about how debilitating ME can be. And in some respects, recruiting severe patients is probably, in some respects, the lower hanging fruit, because these people are desperate for something to be introduced into them. But I don't think, maybe others on the call can help me, but I don't think we have a catalogue of UK severe ME, which is so well refined that you'd know exactly who to go to do that. We have a major problem as well, as some of the people on this call will know, of capacity in this area, because researchers just haven't gone into it. So we don't have the clinical trials centres and units and so on that have got programs in the field. And that's a big issue. If you've got no capacity and no experts working in focal areas like Jeremy and Amy are working in, you've got an issue, because you haven't got a critical mass in any of these places where you can embed some of the complexities of running these programs. So we're going to have to think about sort of how we vitalize, not revitalize, because it's never happened, vitalize the capacity aspect, to be able to deliver some of these things. I don't know whether Monica and others have got comments on that.
Yeah, Professor Hathaway didn't answer what he thinks is needed.
Yeah, well, okay, yeah, that would be good.
Can I? Because we have a problem of not enough senior researchers. And so I think we've actually got to look outside the field, possibly for data scientists or someone like that.
Yeah.
But how do you think we would approach looking for someone?
Yeah, I mean, I guess MS obviously comes to neurologists. So we have neurologists that have been very interested in different aspects of MS, and we have neurology trainees that do research, have 2 PhD neurology registrars as part of this trial. So that's the natural home. I think you've got to work out where your natural specialty home is. Is it infectious disease? Is it immunology? You've got to find those trailblazers that then can do the things. As I said, we put the bits together in terms of the trial design, get them together, come up with something, and then work out where your PIs are around the country. Because there are people, I am sure, and I don't know the field, who are very interested in chronic fatigue ME syndrome. So, but you have to kind of corral them up and get them singing as much as you can on the same hymn sheet, I would say, because otherwise you'll be divided up. You've got to coalesce. And as I said, the UK MS Society, they did a James Lind review of their priorities. Progressive MS was #1. That was 7 years ago. They fundraise, and there we are. So I make it sound simple. It's not. But if you come together, you have a chance of success. If you don't, you'll never have success.
Can you just say how they got their money? Because this is one of the things that fascinates me. The whole of the ME funding, we've had 8 million over 10 years from the UK funding bodies. There's about 6 million over 10 years again from the ME charities. I mean, those are tiny amounts compared with what you've got.
Yes, I mean, I'm no charity expert. I mean, the MS Society has been around for a long time, and they have professional fundraising capacities within them. So perhaps you had to put some money in to get professionals to go out and get the message. And then you had to have a campaign. This is called the Stop MS campaign, which is a headline campaign that the charity and the others, the committees, the philanthropists, etc., coalesce around with. So that it was kind of a one thing that got people together and then fundraising from it. I'm no expert on it.
No, it's great.
Of course, I'm sure if you were to contact the MS Society, chief executive, they would tell you what they did. But that's what you need to. You have to bind people together with a direction of going forward. And although there are problems, of course there are problems, otherwise it will be solved. If you don't do that, you'll get nowhere. Is my rough view. And even if we do this, we may not succeed. So, but at least we had a go, if you see what I mean, to the best of our human ability at this moment in time.
I really echo and agree with everything Jeremy's just said. I would only add that in new diseases or new situations, which even though ME CFS has been around a while, the situation might be different, and sometimes you get unusual situations where, for example, a cardiologist is working on long COVID, and that's partly because there wasn't a specialty community there yet. If anybody was there, it was respiratory, and so sometimes you've just got to reinvent. I think funding is kind of cyclical and very fickle. So for a short period of 2-3 years, there was money in doing long COVID research, but none of the funded long COVID studies have been able to get follow-on funding from NIHR or MRC, and that's the nature of funding. You can lobby NIHR, MRC. There are investigator-led and patient-led, and Jeremy's rightly said about James Lind priority setting exercises, which are worth doing as robust evidence to take to the funders. But yeah, happy to help if you need to use part of our protocol or materials to develop applications. I think this is a real issue across the country. You'll have seen various reports about medical academic and healthcare academic capacity around the country. We were specifically funded because we didn't go to just the Golden Triangle, and we were the trials unit that was outside of the Golden Triangle. And when you go to those sites, they're even more vulnerable in terms of funding. Even we support people with research, nurses, data scientists, trial nurses, and still, you know, if you work in the NHS, you're well aware, and patients are well aware of the strains that are there. So those places will struggle first and close, and we've genuinely faced that. So I think that these are issues higher than all of our pay grades that really affect the nitty-gritty of doing a national study.
Well, thank you very much. I realise we're going over time and people are dropping off now, Monica. So, Claire. So I think we'll probably have to close the discussion. We could go on for another hour, I think. I think what you both demonstrated, Amy and Jeremy, is the can-do in all of this. In other words, yes, complicated, yes, lots of hurdles, but because you both got the resolve to want to do these things, you managed to negotiate the rapids and get something in place. I think we're at that stage, or we're getting to that stage now, where there is the resolve now to want to do something. And the community, I think, is genuinely patient and carer driven. So that is right up at the top of the list, really. And that's the thing that's transformed the ME debates over the last, 5 years, 3 to 5 years, really. So I think, you know, it's very difficult when you've got such a wonderful patient and carer support infrastructure for the funding bodies to walk away from that. And I think we probably need to use that more in the way that we talk to the MRC and the NIHR and the Wellcome Trust or whatever it is we talk to. We do not have a home for ME, and that's a big issue, and it continues to be one, in that it goes to everybody, and most patients have experience of at least half a dozen different specialists when they are even diagnosed, let alone managed. So, you know, that is something that needs sorting out, and I think hopefully when the new care pathways are discussed, you know, this is something that will need to be focused on, and we do need a home for this group of diseases, and it's no good just saying it can go to anybody, because it can't. So thank you both very much indeed, and we may well be back in touch with you if you're willing to help us as we walk along this rather rocky road. But we're not going to give up, and people like Monica and others on this call are absolutely committed to get something done. So your help today has been enormously valuable. So thank you very much.
Can I just put in, I hope to keep in touch with you both. I'm asking people to feed questions through if they want them. There is an email address that they can send to that was connected with this particular workshop. If there are any that I think you could answer that would be helpful for us, is it okay if I forward them to you?
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, we have done a James Lind Alliance thing, and we have top 10, and you know, we've gone down that process, which has been very successful and very helpful. We now need to translate those priorities into practice, and one of those is clinical trials. We're really very keen to do that. So thank you both very much. Thank you, Monica and Claire, for putting everything on today. And you know, it's a moving feast, so let's keep moving along, and we appreciate everybody joining us today. And if you do have questions, do pitch them in, and we can see if we can get our two friends to help us with any further clarifications. So many thanks.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye bye.